The dropship descended through the thin, golden haze of Vareth 6, the twin suns already burning the dunes below into waves of shifting light. The air shimmered as if the entire world were alive with heat, and as the cadets disembarked, the metallic taste of dust filled their mouths. The Galactic Academy's trial commandant stood before them, his tall figure outlined by the sun, voice amplified through a translator sphere. "This trial," he announced, "is about control. You will not fight. You will not flee. You will endure." His gaze swept across the assembled cadets, each representing a different world, scaled, feathered, or furred, and finally landed on the single human among them. "And you will do so without fire." The words fell like a hammer. The crowd stirred in disbelief. Fire had always been the simplest tool of survival, the bridge between the wild and the civilized. To forbid, then what is left? Chew raw dust. The commandant ignored the protests. "Your mission: survive 5 days with the supplies provided. You will find nourishment, maintain your health, and build shelter. Any combustion, spark ignition, or plasma reaction will result in immediate disqualification. Fire is forbidden." The supply drones descended in a synchronized pattern, dropping identical metal crates before each cadet. Eric knelt and unlatched his. Inside, he found basic rations, filtration tablets, a multi-tool, and a thermal sheet. No energy cells, no matches, nothing to create heat. The Academy's rules were absolute. He could hear the aliens arguing as they examined their own kits. The Caroxian cursed the absence of her heat pod. The Cytherians immediately began digging trenches, hoping to find cooler soil to hide in. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by pale ridges of mineral-rich stone and the distant shimmer of what might have been salt flats. Eric sat quietly, elbows on his knees, watching the others scramble. He was not the fastest or strongest in the class, but he had something most of the others lacked: an instinct for improvisation born of generations on a death world. Earth was full of contradictions: cold and heat, drought and flood, predators and prey. Humanity had evolved not by dominating nature, but by adapting to its every mood. He remembered his grandmother's stories about early polar explorers melting ice inside tin cans, and about his father teaching him how to cook with sunlight reflected off car mirrors during a power outage. Those memories returned like faint echoes now. The day dragged on. The temperature climbed to 70 degrees, and the air grew so dry that breathing felt like swallowing ash. The cadets erected standard-issue shade cloths and clustered beneath them. Some tried to use energy shields for protection, but the batteries drained within an hour under the dual-sun radiation. By midday, half the camp had retreated inside makeshift shelters, panting and desperate. Eric wandered among them, observing quietly. He noticed how every design relied on synthetic materials and energy output, nothing sustainable. The aliens' understanding of survival was filtered through luxury. Without tools, they were helpless. When the first sunset arrived, the temperature dropped with violent speed. Within minutes, the dunes hardened under frost, and the same cadets who had baked hours ago now shivered uncontrollably. Eric wrapped himself in his thermal sheet, adjusting it into a crude tent that trapped his body heat. He watched others fumble with their gear, trying to activate emergency warmers that refused to start without electrical ignition. Someone screamed in frustration and hurled a ration pack into the darkness. The commandant's ship was already gone, leaving only silence and starlight so sharp it seemed to hum. Eric switched on his wrist recorder and dictated an entry. Day 1, trial of endurance. No fire allowed. Temperature variance, 60 degrees. Most cadets unprepared for rapid thermal shift. Food supplies appear chemically preserved, but require heat activation for digestion. I'll need another way to cook or metabolize them. No sparks, no combustion, but perhaps there's a loophole. He paused, staring at the twin moons that had risen over the horizon. The rule forbids fire, not heat. He repeated the phrase softly, as if tasting the words. It was not the first time humans had survived by questioning definitions. That night, Sleep came in brief bursts. The wind howled through the dunes, carrying fine sand that hissed like whispers against his shelter. Every few minutes he felt vibrations in the ground, perhaps nocturnal creatures or shifting tectonics. He tried to stay awake, reviewing chemical equations in his mind. Fermentation, exothermic reactions, photosynthetic compounds. The planet's briefing report mentioned native plant life in underground moisture pockets. If something grew here, it metabolized sunlight somehow. Maybe he could use that. At dawn, Eric rose before the others. The camp was a mess of frost-coated fabric and collapsed shades. A few cadets had fallen ill, their bodies unused to the violent fluctuations. He walked toward a ridge where the sand met a patch of pale green growth. The plants resembled gelatinous bulbs clustered around cracks in the stone. When he touched one, it pulsed faintly, releasing a faint scent of vinegar and methane. That was it, a microbial reaction. Life here fermented its own protection from the heat. He took samples with his multi-tool, sealing them inside a small canister. By the time he returned, the camp had awakened to panic. The Cytherians' stored rations had turned rancid, leaking a yellow fluid that stank of rot. The Caraxian was arguing again, her wings quivering with exhaustion. Karak roared that the test was unfair. Eric said nothing. He simply placed his canister on the sand and watched the surface begin to bubble in the rising heat. Tiny pockets of gas formed and burst in rhythmic patterns. He smiled slightly. Fermentation in real time. There was energy here, waiting to be tapped. He sat down, opened his notebook, and began sketching a design. He could use mirrored surfaces to concentrate sunlight, perhaps from shards of broken visors or the reflective undersides of the supply crates. If he angled them correctly, he could generate enough heat to sterilize water or even cook. He would need containers, metal, preferably dark enough to absorb radiation. The crates could serve that purpose. He tore off one panel, tilting it toward the suns and noting the rising temperature. It worked better than expected. As the day advanced, he tested his theory. He placed a ration pack on the improvised reflector and waited. Within 20 minutes, the surface grew hot enough to steam. He poked the edge with his multi-tool, releasing a burst of aroma that spread through the camp. The other cadets lifted their heads in disbelief. Warm food, the forbidden miracle. Some looked suspicious, thinking he had broken the rule, but the observers' drones hovering overhead made no sound of alarm. There was no fire, no combustion, only sunlight, metal, and patience. That night, Eric ate alone under the stars. The others whispered among themselves, torn between pride and hunger. He wrote another note into his recorder. Observation. Heat can be generated and directed without combustion. Definition of fire may be cultural rather than physical. Tomorrow I'll test the reaction of the fermented gas for controlled release. He leaned back, staring at the horizon glowing faintly with residual heat from the twin suns. The trial had only just begun, but already he sensed that the test was less about endurance and more about imagination. Fire had always been humanity's first invention, but not its only one. As he drifted toward uneasy sleep, he remembered something his father once told him while fixing a broken stove during a winter blackout. "Son, when the world takes away your matches, make the sun your flame." Those words echoed in his mind as the cold deepened around him. He closed his eyes, clutching the small canister of bubbling plant matter near his chest for warmth. It gave off a faint, living heat. He smiled. The rule forbade fire, but it did not forbid the will to create it in another form. And that was enough to keep him alive through the long, frozen night. The morning came harsh and silent, the light of the twin suns cutting across the desert like blades. Eric awoke before dawn, his back stiff and his throat raw from the cold night air. The thin layer of frost that had settled on his shelter was already melting, droplets sizzling as they touched the sand. He sat up, brushed off the moisture, and took a long breath. The air was sharp with mineral dust and something else. an acrid, organic smell rising from the ridge where he had collected the strange, gelatinous plants the day before. The canister he kept beside him pulsed softly, its sides warm. Inside, the plant material continued to ferment, releasing slow streams of gas that hissed faintly through a makeshift valve he had built. It was alive, converting decay into energy, and he found the sound oddly comforting. Around the camp, the other cadets stirred restlessly. The Charaxians' wings were drooping, their once iridescent membranes dulled by dehydration. She crouched under a half-collapsed shade cloth, her eyes hollow. Karak, the reptilian, had taken command of the remaining alien cadets, shouting orders that no one had the strength to follow. The Cytherians were sprawled near a cracked water tank, their slick skin turning dull from lack of moisture. It was only the second day, yet the camp already looked like a graveyard. The academy had stripped them of everything familiar, leaving them to face nature without their machines, and for most of them, that meant doom. Eric ignored the chaos. He walked toward the ridge, carrying his multi-tool and canister. The suns were climbing fast, and with them came heat that distorted the horizon. His boots crunched against crusted salt and fractured stone. In the pale light, the gelatinous plants glistened like glass marbles embedded in the sand. He knelt beside one and pressed his palm gently against its surface. It quivered and released a small puff of gas, the smell pungent but tolerable. He realized that these organisms were a kind of natural bioreactor, absorbing solar radiation and breaking down minerals into fuel-like compounds to survive the planet's brutal cycles. He smiled faintly. Nature, even here, had already solved what the trial demanded of him. He just needed to listen. Using his multi-tool, he carved out several more bulbs, careful not to rupture them, and placed them into an empty ration pouch. Each emitted a faint bubbling sound as if breathing. By the time he returned to camp, the heat was unbearable. The ground shimmered, and even the sand seemed to hum. He noticed Karak arguing again with one of the Charaxians, his scales reflecting light like a mirror. "This is impossible," the reptilian bellowed. "Without fire we starve. Without heat we die." Eric passed by without comment. He had already decided that complaining wasted more energy than the heat itself. He reached his shelter and arranged his samples in a line under the shadow of his metal panel. Then he began his quiet experiment. He opened one of the bulbs and poured its contents, a slimy green fluid, into a small compartment of his canister. He sealed it and placed it on the sand, where the sunlight beat down hardest. Slowly, the liquid began to fizz. He crouched close, watching as the reaction intensified. The gas accumulated inside, expanding the walls of the canister until it emitted a soft hiss through his improvised valve. The warmth spread across his fingertips. It was working. He leaned back and exhaled, relieved. If he could find a way to store this energy, he could cook, purify water, maybe even power simple reactions. Hours passed as he refined the process. He adjusted the valves, tested the pressure limits, and recorded his observations on his wrist device. The readings confirmed what he suspected. The gas contained hydrogen and trace amounts of methane, both flammable, both capable of combustion if ignited. The irony made him grin. He had discovered fire without lighting a single spark. Yet he knew better than to use it recklessly. The rule forbade combustion, and the Academy's drones monitored every reaction. He needed a way to harness the energy as heat, not flame. By midday, hunger gnawed at his stomach. The ration packs could not be digested cold. He opened one and examined its label. Heat to activate nutrient enzymes. He frowned. The chemical structure was inert at ambient temperature, meaning it would pass through his body without nourishing him. Around him, the other cadets were learning the same painful truth. He heard someone gagging nearby, a Charaxian who had tried to swallow the raw mixture and was now retching violently. Eric turned away. Compassion was a luxury in the desert. Survival demanded focus. He tilted the metal panel he had used as a reflector the previous day, angling it toward the suns. Then he placed one of his canisters at the focal point, allowing the light to strike it directly. Within minutes, it began to glow faintly as the gas inside expanded. He used another panel to enclose the area, trapping the heat. The temperature climbed rapidly, enough to warm a ration pack placed beside it. The smell of reactivated nutrients filled the air, a scent so ordinary on Earth yet heavenly here. He tore open the seal and took a cautious bite. It was edible. The enzymes had awakened. When he finished eating, he sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead. The twin suns were merciless, but for the first time since arrival, he felt a flicker of confidence. He could work with this. He began sketching new plans in the sand, tracing circles and lines with his multi-tool, designs for an array of reflectors, fermenting pods, and gas channels. The system would use natural heat to power fermentation and then use the biogas for controlled thermal reactions. No fire, no violation, pure adaptation. As he worked, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his concentration. Karak loomed over him, his heavy frame casting a shadow. The reptilian's slit eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Human," he growled. "What are you doing?" Eric didn't look up. "Working," he said simply. "On what?" Karak demanded. "A way to eat," Eric replied, his tone calm. The alien snorted, glancing at the glowing canister. "You break the rule?" "No," Eric said. He adjusted the valves until each produced a faint hum. When the last of the suns dipped below the horizon, he placed a ration pack inside his mirrored panel and angled it to capture the lingering light. The last rays ignited a dull glow across the metal, enough to warm his meal one more time before darkness claimed the desert. He ate in silence, listening to the wind sweep over the dunes. The alien camp had grown quiet. He saw distant figures huddled together, their silhouettes trembling in the cold. He knew that by morning, some might not wake. The academy never intervened early. This was part of the test. The lesson was clear. Technology without understanding was useless. When he finished eating, Eric checked the canisters once more. The fermentation continued steadily. He sealed them tight and stored them beside his sleeping mat, feeling the warmth seep through the metal. It was a small comfort, but enough to ward off the night's chill. Before lying down, he opened his wrist recorder and dictated a brief note. Day 2. Gas generation successful, thermal control stable. The others grow weaker. Tomorrow I'll expand the system, build a full solar oven using the panels and reflective dust from the ridge. The fuel source works. The planet provides everything we need if we pay attention. He paused, looking at the stars, cold, brilliant, and endless. "Funny," he murmured, "how survival always begins with listening." Then he lay back and closed his eyes, letting exhaustion take him. The wind howled again, but he was no longer afraid of it. The planet was hostile, yes, but not impossible. It was speaking in its own language, and he was learning to understand it. For the first time since landing, Eric felt that the trial was not about proving strength or dominance. It was about humility, about bending to nature without breaking. As sleep finally claimed him, the faint warmth of the fermenting canisters pulsed beside him like the steady heartbeat of the living world itself. The next morning began with a strange silence. The usual cries of frustration and desperate arguments that had filled the alien camp were gone. Eric stepped out from his shelter and immediately understood why. The cadets were scattered across the sand, motionless in exhaustion, their shelters half collapsed and their supplies nearly depleted. Only a few remained conscious, their eyes glassy under the unrelenting heat of the twin suns. He could tell that most of them had eaten nothing for 2 days. The stench of spoiled rations filled the air, carried by the dry wind that scraped across the dunes like a whispering blade. The sight made him uneasy. He had been in survival trials before, but never one that stripped away hope so efficiently. He turned his gaze to his canisters. The fermentation process had stabilized overnight. The warm pulse of life within them had slowed to a rhythmic hiss. He knelt beside one and listened. The faint bubbling sound had become steady, predictable, perfect. He could now rely on it as a controllable source of pressure and heat. The time had come to transform the experiment into something greater, something that could sustain not just himself, but perhaps others as well. He took out his multi-tool and the small scraps of metal he had gathered the previous day. If he could build a stable solar concentrator, he could amplify the sun's energy into usable heat, transforming the desert into a kitchen powered by light alone. He spent the next hour scouting for the right materials. The dunes were littered with fragments of alien tech, reflective plating from broken scanners, shards of protective lenses from shattered helmets, and bits of transparent armor that glimmered like liquid glass. He collected each piece carefully, choosing those with the highest reflectivity. He tested them by holding them at an angle toward the sun's and watching which ones burned his skin faster. Once he had enough, he returned to his small camp and arranged them in a semicircle on the ground, their curved surfaces forming a crude parabolic shape. The center point of the reflection, the focal spot, would become his heat chamber. It was a delicate task. The wind constantly threatened to shift the panels, and the sand refused to stay level. Sweat dripped from his brow as he adjusted each fragment, securing them with strips of wire and shards of fused plastic melted under previous sun tests. His hands trembled with exhaustion, but his focus remained unbroken. He was constructing not a weapon, but a symbol, a challenge to the definition of fire itself. When the final mirror was set, the structure looked fragile, almost absurd. A circle of mismatched metal and glass aimed toward the heavens. But when he tilted the entire array slightly and watched the beams converge into a single brilliant spot of white light, he smiled. The temperature at that point surged instantly. The sand beneath began to darken, its surface softening. He placed one of his metal canisters at the focal point and waited. The gas within responded immediately, expanding and vibrating against the container walls. He listened for the faint hiss through the valve. It came faster, then steadier, then constant. Using the multi-tool, he directed a thin stream of the gas toward a small pile of crushed mineral dust, the kind that had turned slightly black after previous heating. He angled the light through the crystal shards, and the focused beam illuminated the pile with a colorless flame that wasn't a flame at all, a silent, glowing reaction of heat and pressure. No combustion, no oxygen burn, just controlled energy transfer. It was heat born of chemistry and sunlight, not fire. The air shimmered above it. He reached out and placed a ration pack on a flat rock above the heat source. Within minutes, steam rose from the seams. The scent that followed was rich and unmistakable. Cooked food. His chest tightened. After days of choking dust and stale water, the smell of warmth and life felt almost holy. He cut open the packet, and for the first time since the trial began, he saw color in his meal. Browned grains, rehydrated vegetables, even the faint shimmer of melted nutrients. He took one slow bite, savoring the taste that reminded him of home. A soft sound broke his concentration. He turned to see one of the Coroxians standing a few meters away, staring in disbelief. Her frail body trembled, and her once bright eyes were sunken. Behind her, Karak appeared, his massive frame outlined by the glare. Both were drawn by the smell, and both seemed unsure whether to approach or accuse. Eric said nothing. He simply gestured toward the device and then back to the sand, showing that there was no flame, no ignition. Just sunlight, reflection, and patience. Karak stepped closer, cautious, his claws crunching through the crusted sand. "You cook?" he asked, his deep voice cracking with disbelief. "With no fire?" Eric nodded. "With light," he said simply. The reptilian crouched near the array, shielding his eyes from the brightness. "It is forbidden," he muttered, still unsure. Eric shook his head. "Only fire is forbidden. This isn't fire. This is heat." He offered a piece of his ration to the Caraxian, who hesitated, then took it. Her wings quivered as she tasted it, and for a moment her expression softened into something close to gratitude. Karak watched silently, then stood upright, his gaze fixed on the glowing reflection. "You use the suns to cook," he said finally. "The suns that kill us." Eric smiled faintly. "They kill because you fight them. I use them." For the rest of the afternoon, Eric refined his setup. He used fragments of mirrored material to build smaller concentrators, aligning them in a pattern that amplified the energy. Soon, the central point reached temperatures high enough to sterilize water and melt certain mineral deposits into crude glass. The process fascinated him. The planet itself was becoming a part of his creation. He noticed that the mineral dust around the focal point had hardened into a clear, crystalline form. He realized he could use this glass to improve his design further, shaping it into pure lenses that would concentrate sunlight more precisely. As he worked, he sensed movement behind him again. The other cadets had begun to gather at the edge of his camp, silent but watchful. Hunger had stripped them of arrogance. They stood under the shimmering heat, eyes wide, bodies trembling from exhaustion. Eric didn't invite them, but he didn't send them away either. He continued his work, and the longer they watched, the more they began to understand. This wasn't magic. It was logic and persistence. When he placed a new ration packet on the improvised oven and the smell of cooked nutrients filled the air again, several of them took hesitant steps forward. He broke off pieces of the warm food and handed them out, one by one. The Caraxian ate first, then Karak, then a few others. The silence that followed was profound. For the first time, none of them argued or complained. They ate with reverence, the act itself a reminder of something ancient and universal, sharing warmth, even without flame. Eric didn't speak while they ate. He just watched the horizon, where the suns began to dip toward the west, painting the dunes with gold and blood-red light. When the last of the meal was gone, he dismantled part of the array, carefully storing the shards and panels for later use. The others lingered, their expressions uncertain. Finally, Karak broke the silence. "You should lead," he said. The words surprised Eric. He looked up and shook his head. "No, I survive. That's all." But Karak didn't move. "You make life where there was death," the reptilian insisted. "That is leadership." Eric met his gaze and saw no pride there, only sincerity. He nodded slightly but said nothing more. As the suns vanished and darkness fell, the air cooled rapidly. The wind carried with it a faint smell of ozone and distant storms. Eric secured his canisters again, listening to their soft breathing hum. He watched the stars rise and thought about what he had created. He hadn't just found a way to eat, he had found a way to turn the planet's hostility into fuel. He wondered if that was the essence of humanity's reputation across the galaxy. Not strength or aggression, but the quiet, relentless refusal to give up when everything else failed. He sat by the fading heat of his solar oven until long after the others had retreated to their shelters. The dunes shimmered under starlight, and the air was still. The silence felt different now, not empty, but waiting. The human had made warmth without fire, light without destruction. He had bent the laws of the trial without breaking them. And though no one said it aloud, something fundamental had shifted that day. The cadets had seen a truth that could not be unlearned, that even under impossible rules, a human would always find a way to turn survival into creation. By the next morning, the dunes of Vareth 6 shimmered with a strange new light. The broken shards of Eric's solar oven caught the suns and scattered the rays like a crown of fractured mirrors. From a distance, it looked as if a small city of glass had risen overnight. The other cadets, drawn by hunger and curiosity, approached cautiously. None of them had slept well. The cold had bitten through their shelters, and the fatigue of malnutrition was beginning to break their bodies. Yet when they saw the faint tendrils of steam rising from Eric's cooking platform, something like hope stirred in their eyes. Eric was already awake, kneeling by his equipment. His movements were deliberate, his face calm and focused. The metal panels he had set the previous day were now arranged into a larger, more symmetrical array. He had used strips of torn fabric and melted sand glass to fix the angles, creating a more stable framework. In the center, his canisters hummed quietly, their valves releasing slow breaths of fermented gas. The setup no longer looked improvised. It looked intentional, almost elegant. The first to approach him that morning was Karak. The reptilian's scales had dulled from dehydration, but his gaze burned with determination. He stopped beside Eric and watched him in silence for a while before speaking. "You make it look easy," he said. Eric shook his head. "It's not," he replied. "It's balance. You can't fight the suns here. You work with them." Karak crouched beside him, the rigid movements of his body betraying fatigue. "Teach me," he said simply. Eric didn't answer right away. He took a ration packet from his bag, tore it open, and placed it on the heating plate made from a polished panel. The light concentrated, and soon steam began to rise again. The smell reached the air, familiar now but still intoxicating to those who hadn't eaten properly in days. He glanced at Karak. "You want to learn? Then you work." He pointed toward the dunes where shards of metal glinted in the distance. "Bring me 10 pieces of reflective plate, smooth on one side, not warped." Karak hesitated for only a moment before rising and lumbering toward the horizon. Within an hour he returned, dragging a makeshift sled full of fragments. His hands were bleeding from handling the sharp edges, but he said nothing. Eric nodded in approval. He took the shards and began fitting them into new mounts, showing Karak how to align them toward the suns using his shadow as a guide. "You see," Eric explained, "each piece catches the light differently, but together they focus it, like purpose." Karak grunted, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Your species uses metaphors for everything," he muttered. Eric smiled faintly. "That's how we remember." As the day grew hotter, others began to gather. The Caraxian cadet who had eaten from Eric's first meal approached, her wings folded tightly against her back. She carried several strips of metallic fabric salvaged from a fallen shade tent. "Can this help?" she asked softly. Eric studied the material. "Yes," he said. "We'll line the ground with it to reflect heat upward. It'll make the ovens more efficient." She nodded and joined Karak in laying out the pieces under his direction. Her delicate hands trembled, but her precision made the work faster. By midday, more cadets had joined. At first, they only watched. Then one of the Cytherians, his amphibious skin cracked and gray from the dry air, began digging shallow trenches as Eric instructed. "The air flows through here," Eric explained, gesturing to the channels. "It keeps the heat from escaping too quickly. It's not just about trapping it, it's about guiding it." The alien listened intently, nodding as he worked, his wide mouth stretching in effort. It was strange to see the group, different shapes, colors, and worlds, moving together for once. The trial had begun as a contest, but now it felt like a shared project of survival. When the array was finally complete, it covered a wide semicircle of reflective panels. The heat radiating from it was intense but bearable. Eric placed 3 ration packs in the center and watched as they began to cook almost instantly. He stepped back and motioned for the others to wait. Within minutes, the smell spread through the air again, but this time, it was not just one man's meal, it was enough for several. The cadets gathered around as Eric divided the food, handing portions to each. No one spoke as they ate. The sound of chewing and quiet sighs filled the silence, replacing the groans of despair that had haunted the camp for days. When they finished, Eric crouched again beside the fermenting canisters and opened one carefully. The gas hissed softly as he released the pressure. He held up a small tube connected to a sealed container of dark liquid. "This," he said, "is fuel. It's made from those plants near the ridge. They ferment in the heat, and the gas they release can store energy. The others leaned closer, fascinated. You feed the plants to make heat? The Caraxian asked. No, Eric said. The planet feeds us. I just help it breathe in a different way. As the suns dipped lower in the sky, Eric noticed how the panels caught the changing light and redirected it beautifully across the dunes. The air around the camp shimmered as if the desert itself had awakened. Even the Academy's observation drones hovering far above seemed to slow their patrols, their lenses glinting as they recorded every movement. He wondered what the instructors thought as they watched. A single human surrounded by cadets of a dozen species, all working together to build something out of nothing. That evening, Eric decided to test his system on a larger scale. He arranged the panels into a circular formation, forming a heat chamber big enough to boil water. The cadets helped gather stones and containers. Karak volunteered to operate the reflective panels, turning them to track the setting suns, while the Caraxian used her thin wings to scatter sand over the outer edges, preventing heat loss. Eric placed a metal basin filled with filtered water into the center and waited. Slowly, bubbles began to rise, then roll to the surface. When the first plume of steam burst free, the group erupted into cheers. For many of them, it was the first time they had seen boiling water without fire. Eric allowed himself a brief smile. Now you can cook anything, he said, or sterilize or clean or make tools. Karak stared at the steaming basin, his expression unreadable. You turn the desert into a forge, he said quietly. You make it obey. Eric shook his head. I don't make it obey, he replied. I listen. It tells me how it wants to be used. That night, no one slept hungry. The cadets shared food, stories, and laughter around the glowing heat of the mirrored field. The light from the solar ovens reflected off their faces, giving them an almost celestial glow. Eric sat slightly apart, watching them with a mixture of pride and caution. He knew the Academy was observing, analyzing every gesture and result. The trial had changed its nature. The question was no longer who could survive, but who could lead through ingenuity. Before he slept, Eric opened his wrist recorder once again and whispered into it. Day 4. Collective effort successful. Solar array operational. Camp morale restored. The others are beginning to understand that survival isn't about endurance. It's about adaptation. When you work with the environment instead of against it, even a death world becomes an ally. He paused, then added softly, I think the instructors wanted us to reach this point. Not to see who would fail, but to see who would share. He closed the log and looked up at the twin moons rising over the dunes. The wind had changed direction. It was warmer now, less cruel. The mirrors gleamed softly in the moonlight, their surfaces catching fragments of stars. Around him, the alien cadets slept in peace for the first time since the trial began. He watched them for a long while, then lay down beside his canisters, which continued their steady, living pulse. As his eyes drifted closed, he felt a deep calm settle over him. The desert, once hostile and merciless, now breathed in rhythm with him. He had not just survived it, he had made it alive again. The dawn of the final day came soft and golden, washing over the dunes like liquid fire. The heat rose early, yet the camp no longer felt like a place of suffering. The once chaotic assembly of scattered shelters now resembled an organized outpost, rows of polished panels glinting in the light, canisters humming quietly as they fermented beneath the sand, and channels carved neatly into the dunes to guide airflow. The air shimmered with the reflection of sunlight caught by dozens of mirrored structures, each built under Eric's guidance. What had begun as one human survival method had become an entire system, a rhythm of life built in harmony with the planet. Eric rose from his mat, brushing sand from his face. His body ached, but the fatigue felt earned, purposeful. Around him, the cadets were already awake. The Caraxian was repairing one of the reflector joints, her hands steady despite the heat. The Cytherians had filled containers with purified water during the night, and Karak stood at the ridge, scanning the horizon. The reptilian's posture was different now, no longer desperate or proud, but steady. He turned when he saw Eric and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "The suns are calm today," Karak said. "Perfect for your ovens." Eric smiled faintly. "Perfect for the last day," he replied. The final day of the trial was not a race or a challenge. It was an observation period. The instructors would soon descend to inspect each camp and review survival logs. The other cadets knew it too. Some of the remaining groups had collapsed entirely, their technology melted, their supplies ruined. Only Eric's camp remained not just functional, but thriving. The faint hum of energy filled the air as the mirrors caught the morning light, focusing it into their central stations. The cadets moved with quiet coordination, feeding the fermenting pods, aligning reflectors, and checking the water stills. There was no command structure anymore. They simply worked together because it made sense. Eric spent the early hours walking through the camp, inspecting each solar station. He paused by one of the canisters, noting the steady release of pressure through the valve. "Stable," he murmured. The Karaxian approached with a data pad salvaged from a broken drone. "I've been recording temperature cycles," she said. "The thermal energy increases by 8% when the mirrors are angled according to your pattern." He looked at her, impressed. "That's better than I expected," he said. "You could teach this system to others." She smiled faintly. "You already did." By midday, the heat reached its peak. The horizon rippled as if submerged under water, and the dunes appeared to melt into one another. Yet the camp thrived. The solar ovens produced steam that rose into the air like banners of triumph. The cadets cooked, purified water, and even used the concentrated light to shape the fused sand into sheets of translucent glass. Eric stood before one of these panels, lifting it toward the sun. The material was perfectly smooth, the color faintly amber from trace minerals. It felt warm and alive in his hands. He turned it slowly, admiring the way the light danced through it. It wasn't just a byproduct of survival, it was creation. In the afternoon, the first of the Academy's ships appeared in the sky, descending in slow spirals. The hum of its engines echoed across the basin. The cadets paused their work and looked up, shielding their eyes. The gleaming vessel landed near the edge of the camp, stirring clouds of fine dust. When the ramp lowered, 3 figures emerged. 2 officers in silver uniforms and 1 older instructor draped in the deep blue of the Academy's senior council. His eyes swept across the camp, expression unreadable. He walked forward, the sand crunching under his boots, and stopped a few paces from Eric. "Cadet Eric Vance," the instructor said, his voice calm but resonant. "You are the designated human participant in this trial, correct?" Eric straightened his posture. "Yes, sir." The man nodded slowly, his gaze moving to the mirrored structures around them. "Explain what I am seeing." Eric took a step forward. "A thermal conversion system, sir, powered by sunlight and fermentation gases harvested from local flora. The setup uses no combustion, no ignition, and no forbidden technology. All heat is generated through reflection and pressure." The instructor studied him for a long moment, then glanced toward Karak and the others. "And these cadets?" "They helped," Eric said simply. "They learned how to build it, how to adapt. We all survived." The older man's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained measured. "You broke no rules?" "None," Eric replied. "Fire was forbidden. Heat was not." One of the officers took readings from a nearby canister, frowning at the results. "Sir, the energy yield from these fermenters rivals low-grade plasma cells." The instructor turned back to Eric, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "Did you intend that?" "No, sir," Eric said honestly. "I just wanted to cook a meal." The instructor's lips twitched into the faintest smile. "That, Cadet Vance, is how discovery begins." He turned and addressed the group. This trial was meant to measure endurance, discipline, and adaptability under constraint. What we see here transcends all three. You have not merely survived, you have innovated. You have turned restriction into invention. That is the true purpose of this academy. His words carried across the camp, and for a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of fermenting gas and the soft clink of glass cooling in the sand. Later that evening, after the officers had documented everything and the ships had departed, the cadets gathered for their final meal. The suns were sinking, their light mellow and golden. The mirrors reflected the glow across the camp, making the sand appear like molten bronze. Eric sat beside the central oven, adjusting the panels one last time to catch the fading rays. He placed the final batch of rations inside, not because they needed to eat, but because it felt right to end with the same act that had begun everything. The air filled with warmth and the faint, comforting aroma of cooked food. When the meal was ready, he divided it among the group as he always had. Karak took his portion and sat down heavily beside him. "When I first saw you," the reptilian said, "I thought your species was reckless, too fragile for the desert. Now I see you differently." Eric chuckled softly. "Humans are reckless," he admitted. "But sometimes that's what makes us try what others wouldn't." The Karaxian folded her wings and smiled. "You didn't conquer the trial," she said. "You changed it." The stars began to appear, one by one, reflected in the polished mirrors like distant fires that the rule could never forbid. The cadets fell silent, each lost in thought. The desert wind had softened to a whisper. Eric looked up at the twin moons and felt something shift inside him, a quiet certainty that this moment would follow him long after the trial ended. He had not set out to lead, yet leadership had found him through necessity. He had not tried to defy the rules, yet in following them too precisely, he had revealed their limits. When the transport finally came to retrieve them at dawn, Eric dismantled his array carefully, leaving behind only the smooth sheets of glass embedded in the sand. They caught the rising light and scattered it into countless beams. As the ship lifted off, he looked out the window and saw the reflections stretching far across the basin, glowing like a living memory of what had been built there. Back at the academy, during the debriefing, the instructors would debate how to classify his achievement. Some called it an energy innovation, others a sociological breakthrough in cooperative survival. But for Eric, it was simpler. When the senior counsel asked him what lesson he had learned, he answered without hesitation. "That fire is only one way to create warmth," he said. "If you take it away, a human will still find light." The room fell silent, and one of the counselors leaned forward. "And what does that mean to you, Cadet Vance?" Eric met his gaze steadily. "It means humanity doesn't survive by strength," he said. "It survives by understanding." In the months that followed, the Academy incorporated his methods into their curriculum. The Vareth thermal cycle became a model for resource adaptation training across dozens of worlds. Yet for Eric, the memory of the desert remained more personal. On quiet nights, he would think of the glowing dunes, the hum of his canisters, and the way the alien cadets had laughed under the moons after days of silence. He never returned to Vareth 6, but sometimes he imagined those glass sheets still there, catching the suns and scattering light across the endless sand, proof that even in the harshest places, humanity's gift was not merely to survive, but to create warmth where none existed. And in that truth, he found peace.